The port city of, did we talk about the Midlands? Yeah. Okay. So again, the Midlands was also referred to as, and that's in the north area, as the Black Country, and it was a dark, it was dark, plus the pollution. This is where this coal is, and so therefore this is where the people are going to go. Because the mines are going to provide jobs, and Manchester, starting off as known as Cottonopolis, as it will be called, will have, and I'll talk about that in a minute as well. Okay, Alexis de Tocqueville said this, he visited, important writer, definitely a source, a reliable source for understanding the Industrial Revolution and Manchester. Manchester's going to be our key. It's also a place that a man named Frederick Engels is going to be learning the cotton trade here before he leaves.
Yes.
Engels, England.
What did I say the rapid problems of urbanization were? Okay.
Disease, crime.
And cholera, I want to talk a little bit more about that.
Cholera ninja.
Little video clips, maybe 3. Okay. Living conditions, I get through that?
So funny.
Okay. Again, we're going to see a little more of that in the video clip. So here is Manchester before it became industrialized. And then here we can see the smokestacks, which were all over each of the boilers. And why it was originally called Cottonopolis is because it's going to be the focus for cotton textiles. Okay, so just a little bit more with him. This is the famous quote. Did we get this?
No.
Okay. This is the famous quote. There are a few quotes that, that could be thrown on the exam. So you'd have to be aware of who they belong to. So he said, from this filthy sewer, pure gold flows. What's the gold?
Cotton.
Cotton textiles.
What?
The profit from cotton textiles. What's the sewer?
The city.
Yeah, all of the horrible living conditions and working conditions with that.
It was so worth though.
So again, you want to highlight his name. There'll be a few other names as well. So the cotton factories here. Here's what I want you to get on some statistics here, okay? That for Manchester. So again, it's going to be the most important city of the Industrial Revolution. 1833, there were 101 cotton mills. More than any other part of Britain. 101 cotton mills in 1833. I want to give you the figures for the numbers of people who worked in them and who they were, so that you have even a stronger feeling for it. There were 4,500 men. 4,500 men worked in these 101 textile factories. 5,700 women. And 7,000 children. Okay, and they worked an average, put it down, of 69 hours a week. I know, it's almost unfathomable. 69 hours a week. But you can highlight the women and children because they will dominate.
They like being on top.
Industrial Lancashire, for example, prospered, with the population of Manchester reaching 303,000 by 1851.
I don't give a fuck.
Before good transport was developed, everything had to be within walking distance of the factory. So all the buildings, houses, schools, shops, and not forgetting the chapel, had to be close together.
The chapel's inside.
Grab some other notes.
Workers woke to the sound of the factory hooter. Their houses were blackened by the smoke from the factory chimneys. And thousands of new houses were needed. For example, Richard Arkwright, the pioneer textile manufacturer, built houses for his workers, which you can still see at Cromford today. He needed 600 workers to run the factory, 300 in each shift.
I said each shit.
Other philanthropic employers, such as Gregg at Style, Salt at Salter, and Cadbury at Bourneville, followed suit. But these places were exceptional. The demand for housing close to the factories brought terrible overcrowding.
God bless Mother and Father. God bless Sarah and Suzanne. God bless William and Tabitha. And God bless all the animals. Amen.
Again, in the
God bless Mother
reenactments,
and
they're way too
Father.
clean.
God bless
The
William and
important thing you
Michael.
understand is
God bless
they
Sarah and
all had to share a
Tabitha.
bed.
And God bless all the animals. Amen. Have you all said your prayers? Yes.
Front to back, that was the typical way to sleep.
Cheese pizza.
People in bed that way.
Cheese pizza.
Coughing is also.
Good night and God bless. Right.
Dog cheese pizza.
Some would say that bad housing has always been with us, but these incredibly cramped conditions were new. Rents were high, and sometimes people could only afford to rent part of a bed, let alone a room.
Right, Mother.
On the floor.
She sleeps on the candle.
Sleeps on the children.
Single people and casual workers would live in lodging houses.
Well,
In
on the floor
Leeds,
is
there
too
were
much space.
220 of these, with an average of 9 beds per room and 5 lodgers per bed.
5
In
lodgers
one
per
survey
bed.
in London, half of the people
Strangers.
only had 1 bed
Oh
for the
my.
whole family.
Get some.
By contrast, the horses that worked at the Dowlas Ironworks at Merthyr in South Wales lived in this magnificent stable block. Overcrowding led to serious health problems. No one understood the need for hygiene, in particular for clean water supply, for proper drainage and sewerage systems, and for waste disposal, all things we take for granted now. And house builders weren't obliged to provide these facilities, though this, combined with overcrowding, made living conditions intolerable. These ironworkers' cottages have been brought to St Fagans Folk Museum from their original site in Merthyr Tydfil and then rebuilt. These are the oldest, which date back to about 1840 and didn't have a privy. People had to make their own arrangements to get rid of sewage. Some had cesspits, some had privies, which were sometimes shared between houses. Often people threw their sewage into the canal. As for water, most people used wells, streams or pumps, or bought their water from carriers. Sometimes the streams that we used for water were the same ones that the sewage was emptied into further up,
Oh,
so
yummy.
disease could spread easily. Doctors didn't know how to prevent it, because the discovery that germs cause disease was not made until 1864 by the Frenchman Louis Pasteur. So how did the authorities tackle these problems?
Don't do it,
The
man.
authorities are very reluctant to intervene in people's lives. For instance, they didn't want to stop working people in towns keeping pigs, even though it was very unhygienic. Pressure was brought to bear on the authorities by people like Edwin Chadwick. His interest in public health came through his concern for poverty. He saw public health as a major cause of poverty. For instance, if the breadwinner became ill, then the family might well become a burden on the rates, and this is what he was anxious to eliminate. He carried out a big survey.
His face.
Okay, now listen, there's at least one thing in there that I want you to make sure. I mean, we sit here today and just go, ooh, but they didn't know that the water was filled with bacteria that could cause sickness. That is not discovered, and put it in your notes and highlighted, until 1864. And that's the germ theory of Louis Pasteur. Okay, 1864. So when you pack a lot of people together, like this is the typical picture, famous picture, it has a railway at the top, so I mean this is going to be after 40s when the railways were built, but people are living close together. There's, you have these tenement housing. You've got shared beds, and I have to tell you, people would sleep with all their possessions on them because there were pickpockets in bed with you. And I've even read stories. I mean, one of the oldest profession, prostitution, was rampant at this time period because there was opportunity to make money. Where they accomplish their activities could be in the part of the rental bed at one end, I guess.
It's okay.
It was on the
They didn't
other
last
side.
that long
Yeah,
anyways.
It's like Rocky.
They just didn't, I mean, everybody smelled bad, so it wasn't that big of a deal, but they're gonna be referred to as the Great Unwashed. Again, a typical family here in, sharing one room. Even here, there's just a partition of a sheet that separates them. So they went from families from being self-sufficient to depending on wages, and they lived in these cramped conditions, cramped apartments that we refer to as tenements. So Dad doesn't look too thrilled over there. Personally, there's no privacy, but there's still a lot of children, so don't ask me.
To public health conditions, drainage, water supply, refuse cleaning and that sort of thing, and published the results as on the sanitary condition of the labouring population in 1842.
Making another
10,000 copies he gave away to people hoping to influence them so that legislation could be passed. 20,000 copies were sold, and yet still nothing was done.
Many of the houses in towns were built back to back, and in these sort of conditions, disease and death were even more likely. People could contract typhus carried by lice, tuberculosis transmitted from one person's breath to another, typhoid, which was spread by drinking polluted water, and cholera, which was a new disease.
Let's not go about color.
Pay attention here. I want you to see the images in case they
With
find
cholera, people had sickness, diarrhea, and sweating, and usually died within 36 hours. There were three major epidemics in the 19th century. The first took 32,000 lives. Then, in 1848, came an even worse one, taking 53,000. During the epidemic in 1865, another 20,000 people were to die.
The real spur to local authorities to take action came from cholera. There was another outbreak in 1847, and this led to the passing of the 1848 Public Health Act, though this was only a permissive act to which authorities could take some action if they wanted. It was not until 1875 that two important acts were passed. The 1875 Public Health Act enforced local authorities to provide decent water supply, medical officer of health, sanitary inspectors, proper drainage, and the whole host of measures necessary to improve public health in towns. And then the Artisans' Dwelling Act of 1875 also insisted on regulations for the first time for good housing. And housing built under this act can still be seen in many towns to this day.
The next problem that had to be tackled in these rapidly expanding towns and cities was the provision of good public transport.
Nestle's milk.
Horse-drawn buses, horse-drawn trams, suburban railways, and electric trams. As they were introduced, they enabled people to live further from their place of work. Fares were cheap, and so more people could live in the suburbs.
Nuts.
This is a horse tram, which, along with the horse bus, became popular in many towns. As transport improved, the city centre became much as it is today, mainly a place for work, for shopping, and for entertainment.
I want to make a couple. Monster Soup, formerly known as Thames Water. That's the River Thames that flows through London. Go ahead, guys.
See a track guy?
Huh?
Bye.
Yeah, go ahead. You can contribute.
Oh, you can take the trash can too.
Later. Now listen, on there they talked about cholera from outbreaks from 1831 to 1865. What I want you to understand and make sure, this disease right here is the disease of the Industrial Revolution, and it still appears periodically. It's from infected water that's infected with fecal matter. Since you didn't have any pipes bringing fresh water in yet, or sewage being piped out, and people used outhouses, and then they got their water from either the river or the well water, it got contaminated. The problem is people did not understand the cause of it until we get to the 1864 germ theory of Louis Pasteur, okay? It wasn't the only disease, but cholera, let me just say, first of all, a Dr. Snow became concerned about cholera, and I have a book on him and how and they can actually trace the outbreak of cholera to a specific house in 1854, the actual house, and it happened to be an infant baby that ultimately had gotten cholera and had died, and that the mother with the diapers and all the stuff then, was thrown out, and it contaminated the wet well water, which because of some other circumstances just happened to be at a little higher level and spilled over. The thing was, the authorities absolutely did not think that cholera was caused by water. They thought it was caused by bad air, mal-ar, like malaria, bad air. And no matter, scientists and people in authority, they become know-it-alls, and they don't like to have their ideas challenged at all. But eventually what Dr. Snow did is he went ahead and went door to door, and he plotted where deaths took place. All those red dots are where a death took place. And then he also, these are the pumps there, and what he found was that cluster of them here on Broad Street around that particular pump. And even though he indicated to the authorities that he believed it, they really wouldn't believe it. People continued to die. Now the horrible thing about cholera is this. It causes you to lose all your bodily water, usually massive diarrhea. Okay, and so what happens is, and this is what's so horrible about this disease, because you're dying of it, is that as your body's beginning to shut down, the last organ to shut down is your brain. And your body takes whatever moisture you have left to your brain. So you are cognizant in those 36 hours that you're going to die. Now, did everybody die? No. As someone asked and peered through, isn't it just possible to just replenish your water? Yes, as long as the water is not infected, okay? And if you didn't know the water was infected to begin with, why would you even know that? So unless somebody got sick here and then maybe they went out to the rural area where family was and then started drinking water, they might. But this was a horrible way to go. It is a disease of the Industrial Revolution. And they mentioned typhus, which is carried by lice. People didn't wash. Typhoid fever, also from polluted water. And as the gentleman was saying here, is that authorities were loath to make any changes. This is part of this laissez-faire. Keep your hands off, okay? And so 1848, Public Health Act. And in fact, and then also the transportation will allow the middle and upper classes to move away from the town center. See, the Soho district here was the poor part of London. Okay, so here he had rejected the idea that disease was caused by pollution or bad air. All right, and so ultimately, the rich at least will be able to move farther out, and they'll be able to take advantage of clean water. You know, it's funny because in the book they talked about how the water from that particular pump, which today, if you go to the Soho district, is like the Rodeo Drive of London today. It's the upscale, and there's actually a water pump there with a plaque on it that says, "This is the water pump of the famous cholera outbreak." Okay.
Can you fix it?
No, it's not. It's, yeah. No, it's not, doesn't work. It's just there. But at any rate, the water supposedly from this pump was supposed to be so delicious that there were some family members who lived in outlying areas, and whenever they would come into town, they would get water from here and take it back home with them. And there were some people that died of cholera from water they transported from here. So here is Death's dispensary, okay? Water pollution. We'll begin then to see with Leeuwenhoek, with his microscope, these organisms in there. And they begin then various attempts to filter the water. Sand filtration was introduced in 1829. Robert Koch, also famous, was appointed director establishing the first water filtration system. Okay, oops, backtrack. Okay, now here's the Le Petit Journal showing La Cholera as Death's Reaper. Now, the next one's going to be a treat for you, the next little video clip. Do any of you remember the series called Dirty Jobs?
Oh, yes.
So, there is a British version of Dirty Jobs, but they're the dirty jobs of the Industrial Revolution. So.
Cities didn't stop growing after the Industrial Revolution. London's population quadrupled from 1 million in 1800 to 4.5 million in 1880. It wasn't just the biggest city in Britain, it was the biggest the world had ever seen. And it wasn't just teeming with humans. There was only one form of horsepower for transport, and that was, well, a horse. Or rather, thousands and thousands of horses.
And of course every horse had its own active bowels, which meant there was loads of poo all over the place. So you weren't just dodging the horse and cart, you were dodging all the stuff that they left behind them. I mean, imagine what the state of the streets would have been. It would have been virtually impossible to get across, particularly if you've got nice clothes on, if you're a fine lady with her long coat and her long dress. So the city threw up another worse job, which was crossing sweeper. So am I allowed to do this?
Absolutely. But in order to maintain your right to do so, you have to do it regularly. Some people actually manage to claim a single crossing for 10, 20, 30 years, and to make a good living out of it.
Well, this is my first morning, so I'll clear a path for you, and then off we go, right? What sort of people did this?
The poorest of the poor, mainly the elderly and young children, a lot of disabled people, a lot of people who couldn't get any other kind of work. It really was on the edge of begging. One group who were regularly identified as crossing sweepers were black refugees from the American Revolution, ex-slaves who ended up in London with no settlement, no place to go, and no employment.
This is mainly young people?
They ran across the whole gamut of ages, from 12-year-olds through 90-year-olds. Someone typical might be someone like William Donovan, who was 19 years old, lived in a common lodging house with 98 other people in Macklin Street in London. He would have earned just a few pence a day taking care of, owning a particular crossing.
Right, darling, over you come.
Let's run over
Pretty
by
good, I
the
think,
horse.
for a first. Wow. How much did I get for this? Cheers, love.
A farthing, a halfpence, a penny.
She
Okay,
had to
if
walk
you're
through the
lucky,
pool.
You got something. But the important thing
Like,
is you couldn't
literally
actually
on the
ask for
side
it.
of the
It had to be in the form of a tip. If you asked for it, that became begging and you were subject to the vacancy laws.
So I couldn't advertise.
Well, you could advertise by, for example, writing signs in the manure itself, or perhaps making little sculptures in it.
What sorts of signs?
Well, the 19th century equivalent of "Hungry and homeless, please help." You could say "God bless the poor" or "God bless the Queen." There are examples of people creating anchors and flowers.
Oh, that's very nice, isn't it? Although I have to be honest, it wasn't that difficult a job.
That's what made it so good for the disabled. There are instances of crossing sweepers missing both legs. There are characters like Joe in Dickens' Bleak House, who's essentially mentally retarded, but could still make a living, a very meager living, as a crossing sweeper.
Oh, there you are, little smiley face. So what was the downside?
You really needed a crossing sweeper when it was cold, when it was wet, and you didn't want to be on the street yourself. If you were in rags, you were freezing. Something else they did was tumbling. Young boys, in particular, would tumble across this crossing in advance of the person they're leading across. So in combination with your advertising, and a bit of tumbling perhaps.
I think I'll just stick with the drawing for the moment. I did do a pretty good job.
Absolutely, I'd cross on that. Okay.
But it wasn't just horse poo that provided a living to those that wanted to keep. Then as now, people in cities kept dogs, and there was dog poo all over the place. You wouldn't have thought, would you, that there'd be a job where you could make good money collecting up this
Pay
stuff.
attention.
But there was, in the 19th century, pure
This
collector.
is the best singer.
Wine pure.
They call it the pure
Joke. It's ironic. I mean, just particularly pure. This muck is there. The dog muck was sold to tanners, where it became basic in the tanning process, and the pure collectors were usually elderly women who could make 6 or 7 shillings a day doing this. Trod in this. Mind you, if you were really lucky, you could get a contract with a local dog kennel, in which case you could make up to 10 bob a day. I think I've just trodden something actually.
He's funny. Okay. So make sure, let me explain to you what the dog poo was for. It was in the tanning industry. So if you think about it, here, when we talk about tanning of leather, so, yeah, not that kind of tanning. Yeah, they did tan. There's no sun there anyway. So basically, when you slaughter the cow for the meat, you've got the hide, but the hide has all this hair on it, so you gotta remove the hair. So you take the dog poo and you sweep it, rub it into the hide of the hair, and I guess the acidic nature of it causes the hair to fall out. I don't know what's in it, but it causes the little hair to fall out of the hide, leaving behind the leather, then that can be processed more. Just like to tell you, I'd rather pick up the poo on the street than be involved in any part of the tanning operation. It was pretty disgusting. Okay, now, I'm going to give you 2 authors that are going to be important, even if you just name drop them in an essay. One of them is Elizabeth Gaskell. You should all remember Elizabeth Gaskell.
Mary Barton,
I mean,
Tale of
you
Manchester
have-
Life.
Anyone? Yeah, I know, just because she was in the last DBQ. Okay, so listen, in that case, see, here's one of the reasons why it'll get easier to do DBQs later in the year, because you have the history behind it, but you didn't know anything about Elizabeth Gaskell. So she is from 1810 to 1865. She's an author. who lived in Manchester, and her most famous book of many she wrote is called Mary Barton, A Tale of Manchester Life. Okay, and what's important here is our owners did not improve wages and working conditions because it cut into their profits. And eventually, though, there will be regulation that will help the workers out. One of the important things about these authors is they made people aware of the conditions of the lower classes. So, but she did have to publish this anonymously, number one, because she was a woman. But give me another reason why. Because who is she critical of in the writing? The owners. The owners are. But who's reading the books? The workers aren't reading. They can't. They're not educated. They know. Who are the people that can read? Which class? The owners. Okay, the middle classes, okay? And yes, the father may be the owner of factories, but you have to understand this is the 1800s. We're going to get into what's called the Victorian era of British society that was basically dominated by the values and morals of Queen Victoria. And the fact of the matter is, this is an era where our Anglican Church becomes more evangelical and is looking to kind of have missionary expeditions to places like Africa and this and that. And again, if you're Protestant, you read, and these books are now being published. But she's critical of the working class. I'm sorry, critical of the owner class. See, also, I'll talk about it later, but also in the Victorian era, the wife, the mother, and the children were isolated from the dirty world of capitalism. That was the man's world. In the Victorian era, the man went out, and the family was at home. And then, of course, where did they live?
Far away.
Far away from the city, so they weren't aware of this. But because they're because they're Christians now, and they're more evangelical in their approach to Christianity, they become concerned about the poor. And once they begin to read these stories, where we see her as a champion of, the supporter of the working classes, this is going to make its way to demands that Parliament make some changes. Get those kids out of the mines. All right, and ultimately we're going to see, that's why we have this big long list here that I gave you, and that's not even it's just a little minor list of parliamentary reforms. We're not having these in the rest of Europe because we have a government right now that is democratized. So she was a friend of Charles Dickens, and Charles Dickens will be the main influential campaigner, and I'll talk about him in a moment. So, what I want you to make sure you understand is that this is these factories in Manchester, the 101 textile mills, hiring mainly women and children, this was unskilled labor. Child labor could be used because the tasks were very simple. Simple tasks. And while wages were low, they actually weren't, I'm not going to say that bad, but this is unskilled labor. Okay? The fact that they could get a job, and if they could get every member of the family all working, they could survive. Okay? So it was not enough to support a family, but it's one of the reasons why they sent their children out to work as young as 6 years of age. And the jobs in the factories were so mechanical, it didn't take much effort. The big effort was keeping the workers, and especially child labor, awake and working, yeah, and alive. But they, that was one of the things. Women labor too, because again, they could be hired for lower wages. Now the men aren't happy about this, but we begin to see legislation passed that will prohibit women working in some areas, especially mines and that kind of thing. All right, now by the 1840s, 75% of the labor were women and children. 75% of the labor were women and children. And the working conditions, again, that's just a basic no-brainer. It's on, some of the handouts I gave you, but the working conditions, there were long hours, low wages, dangerous, dirty, loud, okay, machines clanking away, and then what you also had, and because you have so many children working, they become deformed as they're growing up because they're stooped over, whether it's in the mines, though that's going to end, but in the factories they're stooped over and underneath and all that kind of thing. A new race of people. And I put it in quotation marks because we're really talking about cripples. And these are the characters in the Dickens books. Some of the characters, from Tiny Tim on, and then you had others, that had physical, mental impairment. That was very typical. That's why I was glad, I want to show you the dirty jobs because this was a job that, street sweeper that someone that was mentally impaired could do. Okay, but you also had frequent unemployment because this is a new industrial capitalism. And what it'll have, this frequent unemployment, are business cycles that go up and down. When the business cycle for the business went down, then people were just let go. Then when they were, business got good, they were hired. There was no protection of the worker yet. See, that's why I want you to differentiate. So by the time we get to the later 1800s, really by the 1870 on, where you have an Education Act, reduce work. They're going to reduce the work week in 1875 to 56 hours. It's reduced to 56 hours, but from 69, that's a good thing. An extra hour to sleep. Again, wages were low, not adequate to survive. So here's Charles Dickens. He is our man of just 2 years ago. You probably didn't pay attention, but there were lots of articles in the paper on him because it was the 100-year birth, the 100-year, 200-year, sorry, 200-year bicentennial. Okay, social campaigner. Again, well, let's go through, and don't tell me A Tale of Two Cities, that, even though it has working class, but what are some of his other books that has these? Oliver Twist has to be on your list.
Christmas Carol.
A Christmas Carol. Hard Times. Great Expectations. No. Okay? No, that was Kipling. We'll talk about him when we get to imperialism. Okay, again, and he started off in a workhouse himself, and he worked in a factory as a child, putting labels on. Huh? Not debtor's prison. That's another thing. These are workhouses for orphans. Okay, and again, very much this Victorian class system. And the Victorian class system, I want you to understand this. I'm going to get into it more as we get into the middle of the 19th century. The Victorian class system is where the poor were viewed as poor, and I'll pick up with that because they were considered to be lazy. It's the same sort of ideas that are still permeate through society today. So I'm a little bit behind here because I did the essays and I still need to do that. So I will finish this one up tomorrow. Just remind me that's 91. I'm on the start of as study guides. Okay, and I'll be giving you all of those with specific due dates, and part of your spring break will be to work on that. As I told you at the beginning, the winter break, Christmas break is yours. And spring break is mine. All right. All right, so what I wanted to make sure on Charles Dickens here, on these, that you need to understand the list of books you have, of which you should at least know Oliver Twist.
Oliver's Twist. The plot twist.
Dan, he represents a couple things that are important. Critique of child labor, poverty, and I wanted to talk about the Victorian class system just a little bit more with you. Okay, so make sure you understand it. This is, and we're going to talk about it once we get to Queen Victoria, who becomes queen through, mid to all of the 1800s, and her values will permeate through society. This is also an era when our Anglican, Protestant, English Christians become very evangelical, looking to go out and spread Christianity to places like Africa, because we're gearing up into the age of imperialism, okay, as well as our British being very interested in finding the sources of the Nile and all these other kind of explorations, getting to the South Pole. But at any rate, the Victorian class system was when the British believed that the poor were poor because they were lazy. Okay? They were poor because they were lazy. And immoral as well. All right? And generally, for the most part, they didn't really favor, any kind. They will become humanitarian, but they didn't really want to disrupt the kind of the invisible hand of Adam Smith that regulated the economy and laissez-faire. All right, they really believed also in this kind of self-made man, that individuals had the ability to pull themselves up by their bootstraps, and that's a famous phrase. Have you ever heard of it before?
Yeah.
You pull yourself up by your own bootstraps, meaning you do the work and you will succeed. And if the poor are poor, it's because they are lazy. The problem is it doesn't really work out that way. All right? They did work really hard, the poor. They just couldn't get ahead. And they won't get ahead until they get some help from the government in terms of education, as well as reducing the work week so they can survive. His books dealt with sanitation and workhouses, especially for orphans. Here is the quote. I don't know who wrote this quote. I got it from a long, long time ago from a video that had featured Charles Dickens. But poets are the unofficial legislators of the world. What does that mean?
They're like,
They're the people who bring the things up.
They bring what up? They bring issues up through their writings, okay? And they make people aware. They make people aware through their stories, okay? And such that leads people to demand that there are more changes to be made. Okay, so this image is of which of Dickens' stories?
Oliver Twist.
Oliver Twist, can I have some more? And what are the boys behind? We asked. Now, they're referred to as the Cotton Lords, which might be one way we will refer to them. Definitions of the Cotton Lords are first industrial capitalists who made their money on textiles. Yeah, okay, don't think just cotton, it's cotton textiles, okay? They were, again, the epitome of our Victorian class system. They were the self-made man who worked hard by pulling themselves up by their own bootstraps. They were the self-made man. And they represent our middle class who through hard work, intelligence, could, make themselves rich. They were hard-working, and they tended to, again, view the poor as lazy. They valued laissez-faire. They did not want government regulation. And they felt they were helping the poor by giving them Jobs, yeah, jobs. There's a, they really, the way that charity will begin to be established, and it had been going back through history, but nonetheless, they felt that they were giving jobs, and this was a way that the poor could, through hard work and perseverance, pull themselves up by their own bootstraps. Okay? They did not want any regulation of business. They used child labor mainly because, even though they didn't want to often, they did because, well, they didn't really want to, okay? But competition made them do it. If they didn't do it, others would do it. So competition, and that's going to be a key term we're going to be talking about. So what we see here is a typical cotton lord family, a middle-class family. They're gathered around 4 o'clock, and what are they doing that becomes a British tradition?
Drinking tea.
They're drinking tea. And by drinking tea, then now they also have, which the poor couldn't afford until wages begin to go up because of legislation, but sugar and cream added to it, that was that would have been a dream for the lower classes, but that's what they're doing here, okay, along with biscuits and butter and that kind of thing. That becomes the tradition. We're going to see, as you see, the women dressed in the Victorian style. They are of the interior, okay? The men are the men that go out into the hard, harsh world of cutthroat competition. Now, Robert Peel is we're going to mention him as an example of one of our prime ministers, because we're now going to begin to talk about political parties in Britain in the 1800s. We're really going to see them take off. What started with the Glorious Revolution, or before, with the Tories and Whigs, either in support of James II or against, are going to morph into political parties. So when we get into the 1800s, you're going to have to be aware of political parties, what platforms they represent. Robert Peel, he's going to come in and he will be prime minister twice in the 1800s. Numerous reforms. One of the problems in cities is the crime. In these emerging urbanized cities was crime, and he's going to introduce police reform and establish the first police forces for large cities. So they actually are referred to, the police in the United States, as what? No, that's Scotland Yard is going to be there at CIA. What do we call?
Inspector.
A copper.
We call them in this country cops.
Bobby.
No.
Bobby.
They're named after Robert Peel. Peelers. Not called peelers.
Robert.
I'm getting robbed. Where's a peeler?
Bobby.
Call the peelers.
Bobby is Bobby. I said Bobby. Robert Pins. Robert Exley.
Robbie's.
Bob.
You know what? Listen, that's more of an American thing. If you're English, you would be called Robert. If you're Americans reduce everything down to the shortest slang term. You get Bob. Also, listen, these Reform Acts, he's going to play a role in this, having this path. A couple things here. The one in 1844 was protecting women workers. Also, now this is going to be serious here, these what are called corn laws. I don't know why they call them corn laws. It should be just like grain laws. Corn was grain.
Because it's rather corny.
And what the corn laws did, this was protectionist. These were protectionist tariffs on imported grain. That was to protect who?
Landowners.
Yeah, the landowners in Britain, so that they could, charge whatever they wanted. The problem is the potato famine of the 1840s is going to have such a profound impact, and since Ireland is part of the British Empire, huge numbers of Irish are going to starve or are going to emigrate, and they're going to push to repeal this. This represents what we're going to be talking about in Britain as free trade, a movement toward what is called free trade. And that is in exact opposition to mercantilism. Okay, so. Okay, so I want to go on to part two, which really part two of the Industrial Revolution will be the impact of steam, okay, on the factories, on transportation. That's really what this second part is about. So let's just kind of go through this. We're going to see a few video clips here that are about 5 minutes each. So Thomas Newcomen, he's really experimenting with the steam engine as early as 1712. That's well before the Industrial Revolution is going. But remember, what I want you to be thinking about as far as the Industrial Revolution is that it's all about a search for power. Ramping up power. Because when you ramp power up, it improves production. And improving production means more profits. So we have a constant search going on. This is the age of innovation in Britain. Thomas Newcomen, he's really dealing then with trying to create a machine, a powerful machine that operates according to steam. The problem with it, and it will be used in the deep mines. What was the problem that we saw with the steam engine, this Newcomen engine? It used more coal than making a profit on, okay? So the problem was it used too much coal, and part of it was because the power was a beam power, up and down, was not very efficient. But what it does is once it's mastered, and then once it's replaced by the Watt machine, which is rotative power, that will increase the power. And that will make it more cost-effective, is the term we use. It was not cost-effective to start with in the mines because it used too much coal. You're using more coal to make the machine run than you're bringing coal out of the mine. But it does expand coal production. So this is all a part of these connections. So this is basically the Newcomen engine used on the coal mines. And it was first used in 1712. So let's take a look at this shift from water power to steam power.
Before the Industrial Revolution, the world knew only 4 basic forms of power: human strength, animal strength, wind, and water. All of these sources of energy have their limitations. In this program, we look at what happened when more power was needed. The Industrial Revolution created a demand for more energy. We shall see how that need was met by looking at the evidence of early steam power, which now forms part of the manufactured landscape.
Dude, they have all the jams.
Like 2 minutes.
Oh boy. You know what? That's what I do when I go home. I look up Newcomen engine working.
This corn mill at St Fagans Folk Museum in Wales is worked by water. Water power is used first to haul the sacks of grain to the top of the building.
Sacks of grain.
As you can see, wood formed an important part of mills like this. They were built by millwrights, and it was the skill and ingenuity of millwrights that was used to build the first steam engines. Although the machinery is predominantly of wood, it's far from primitive. Mills like this involve quite complex technology. In this watermill, the grain works its way down through the building by gravity to be ground into flour between the heavy millstones which absorbed most of the power from the mill's water wheel. But don't think that because it isn't driven by electricity or even steam, it isn't powerful. Because a wheel like this one can drive all the machinery in a sizable mill. But it needs a consistent supply of water. Of course, the more water there is, the greater its potential power. Samuel Gregg realized that when he harnessed water to drive the machinery at the mill, which he built here in the middle of the countryside. This great water wheel, made of cast iron and wood, generates 200 horsepower to drive all the machinery in the Quarry Bank mill. But that was about as much as you could produce with water power. A larger mill would require more power than any water wheel could provide. Another problem was that in summer, the water tended to dry up, which meant that workers went on to short time. But in winter, when there was plenty of water, they had to make up.
All right, so James Watt now, he's the one name that you really need to know. Newcomen starts the ball rolling. Watt is going to polish it off into a well-oiled machine. So he perfects it. And that's going to be in 1769, and this is why we really don't see we really won't see steam engines used in the factories till, after that and into the 1800s. Now, very typical of this time period, we're going to be seeing partnerships, entrepreneurial partnerships. And with Matthew Boulton, who was who had the money, okay, and James Watt, who had the technology. They'll combine together and begin to export steam engines. And they're going to be applied then especially to ships and to locomotives that are in the initial stage right now being developed. So, steam is going to replace what as the source of power? Water. And because steam will replace water, our factories can now move to where? To where? To cities where the population is. They move to the labor supply. And that will really ramp up urbanization now. Once the factories are located in the cities, then we begin to see a rapid growth of urbanization. Okay, so this is actually, you know what, when you go to England, be sure to stop in and visit all those Industrial Revolution museums. Here we can see, this is 1884 factory in which the power source here, they're actually making brushes here, is steam power, okay? And it's coming through, it'll be an external boiler with a smokestack at the top, feeding it coal. And it will ultimately, and this is why the ultimate impact of this, the smokestack, again, will also be pollution. So we're going to also have, and this is important, once steam engines are perfected and applied to factories and transportation, a change in the landscape. The landscape is going to look different, totally different. And what we call it this is a typical industrial landscape. 1833, where we have large steam-powered mills begin to open up and dominate the landscape. This is an engraving to show you what our new huge structures are looking like. Here's a typical this is a textile factory where they're doing weaving and spinning together. And so at the right you can see the stack that's basically producing the power. On the base floor would be where the large looms are located, okay, the big weaving looms. The second and third floors would be the lighter machines for the spinning machines, and at the top they would actually be doing some of the processing. I don't think they had elevators. They don't have elevators till the later part of the 1800s, like 1880. Now let's take a look at application of it to transportation. This is an early steam locomotive that Newcomen was working on.
That's my ride.
Or rather, Newcomen was not working on this. Was actually a Frenchman developing it. He's the first to apply it to a vehicle. And that is in 1769. We have a locomotive powered by steam. So it's a self-propelled road vehicle. Does it look like it's easy to maneuver?
Yes.
That would be a big no. And it only
It's my Pimp-mobile.
moved at the pace of walking, just slow walk. You could run faster than this thing could go. The problem, and also we'll see at the same time, they have to ramp up steel production to remove impurities from the iron. Because once these boilers got too hot, if there was any kind of impurity in the iron when it was molded, they would just crack it and sometimes explode. So let's take a look first at the evolution of transportation, because it takes a while for the railways won't even get going until we get really the age of railway building will be 1840s, while the first rocket locomotive by Stephenson is in 1830. But so we have to start with canals. So we see just some images here of canals. Canal building will be a couple things. 1790s is when we really begin to see real major canal building. These are supported by Parliament, parliamentary acts. There were 50 canal parliamentary acts passed, 50 of them. And they were highly desired because they were the best way to haul the heavy coal and iron, as well as delicate products like glass and the famous Wedgwood porcelain that England is known for. And yes, they will, you know, once, and this is really, you know, they often built, they needed to have the factories near rivers and near canals, both of them, okay, to start with until steam power. So this is actually from Dennis Diderot's encyclopedia of a profile. And generally speaking, these are barges. They're pulled by horse with a rope on the side, okay? And this is a lock. They had to devise a way, obviously, to move from lower to higher elevation or back down again. So they build what are referred to as canal locks, in which you have gates in front. And once the ship, you know, moves in here, what will happen? It's moving in here. The gate is closed. They will be able to pump water out. That lowers the ship, then the gate opens. Any of you ever seen any locks before? Where did you see one? Seattle. Yeah, the one that I really is very, I don't know how that one is, but the locks on the St. Lawrence River between Canada and the United States. If you go to New York, the state of New York, and you go there's the Eisenhower locks, and they are amazing to see. You can see these huge tankers coming from the Great Lakes, and they literally weave themselves into the lock where there's only maybe 2 feet on each side of these massive tanks. I have some pictures. I used to show this in my geography when I used to teach regular geography. They would move in, and then the gates would shut, then they would just, the water would just pump out, the ship would lower, you could watch it go, the gate would open, and out it would go into the sea of, and you have platforms up there, you can watch it, they have schedules when they say the ships are coming, and you can just sit there and you can picnic and watch it, it's kind of fun. If you're doing a road trip, it's fun to do that. Maybe I'm the only one that would find that interesting.
It's just like we go there, it's like this Miss Pusa on top of the
Here's
hill.
a
All
typical
you
canal there, where the horse is pulling the barge by rope. Now, when it would come to a hill, they would often have to construct a tunnel for the barge to go through, and the horse couldn't go through it, so I'll show you how they dealt with that.
But areas that were a long way from the sea and had no navigable rivers to serve them, like the Midlands, were not developed. Of course, water transport could be made easier if canals were dug, because a canal could be made to go almost anywhere. The pioneer construction of the canal age was the Duke of Bridgewater's Canal, which ran from his coal mines at Worsley into Manchester. Although the distance was only 10 miles, it had previously been too expensive to carry the coal by pack horse in order to sell it. People marvelled at this aqueduct which carried the canal over the river at Barn. When the canal opened, the cost of transporting coal was reduced by half. Industry was attracted to the new canal. Here in Stoke, Josiah Wedgwood set up a new factory and his home at Etruria by the Trent and Mersey Canal, which he had helped to pay for. Cornish china clay could be brought by sea to Liverpool and then by canal to Stoke. This reduced his freight charges from £2.75 to 75 pence per tonne. This factory in Stoke-on-Trent still uses the canal. It's ideal because the raw materials for pottery are bulky and heavy, and the finished product is very fragile. The early canals, like those built by Brindley in the 1770s, were winding and narrow, avoiding the need for expensive engineering. But they were slow. Later builders like Telford used cuttings, tunnels, embankments and aqueducts to make straighter canals, which cut down the journey time. Harecastle Tunnel near Stoke is an example of the old and the new together. On the right you can see the old narrow tunnel entrance. And here, its later successor. From the 1770s to the 1840s, it was canals that met the transport needs of industry. This canal was built by Lord Dudley to get limestone from his mines to the lime kilns and then to send it out to the iron-making industry. The limestone mines were deep inside the hill, and so the only way to get the canal to the right point was to construct a tunnel. In most cases, a continuous arch of brick formed the roof of the completed tunnel, but where the rock was strong enough, no further support was needed. Here you can see how the tunnels were excavated, by men using only picks and shovels. As you travel through the hill, you can still see where the limestone was mined. Sometimes the results are spectacular, as here in what is now called the Singing Cavern.
music.
Most early
Asian music than anything else.
had no towpath, so while the horses walked over the hill, men propelled the boats through the tunnel themselves, lying down and walking, or legging as it was called, on the tunnel's roof or side.
That's the part I wanted to see.
It could take as long as 4 hours to leg a boat through this
That guy
particular
must have
tunnel.
massive thighs. Legs of steel. How did he get
Oh, just one more.
He gets to that part and really stop.
Oh, I made it. And he gets up and it's like, oh, fuck.
Still going.
We're almost there, man. Come on. You can do it. Come on, man. We're almost there. For myself. And anybody who's in track.
Canal boats carried all sorts of
You're not
raw
on track.
materials for industry, and it was this area, the Midlands, that benefited most. It now had a network of canals to take coal and iron to the factories of the Black Country. The result was phenomenal growth. In the Potteries, the effect was the same. The population of Stoke-on-Trent, for instance, rose from 7,000 in 1760 to 20,000 in 1785.
Okay, so as an example now, what we're going to see is the American Robert Fulton.
Buys a Michael Bolton.
Yeah. Yeah, you try to finish this up today. Robert Fulton, he buys a Bolton steam engine, and what he's going to do, what Fulton does then, he applies the steam engine to a steamboat. So in 1838, we have the Great Western as a first fully steam-powered ship capable of crossing the Atlantic Ocean. And I believe it crossed the Atlantic in 15 days. So Fulton, he buys the engine in 1807, and it takes a while for this to be equipped on a ship. So in 15 days, again, what's significant about that is it will revolutionize and it'll lower costs of transportation. And that's what we're really looking at here. The railways, though, are going to be more significant to start with because they're going to replace the canals. And what we're also going to see, and you'll see it in the little video clip here from the same series, a man named Richard Trevithick is going to take a bet. And there were often competitions that were offered up in England. It was the land of, innovation and competitions to get innovators out there to work on perfecting something. And Richard Trevithick is going to take a bet that he can move a large amount of cargo over rail lines, and we'll see that in a moment. Eventually, George Stephenson will apply it to the first locomotive that will run on tracks in 1829. And this, he will call his locomotive the Rocket. And it depends what source you look at, but it averaged between like 16 to 24 miles per hour. That's it. And when they have the inaugural run in 1830 between Liverpool to Manchester, where they set the first rail line. That's in 1830. Once that is set up, they will find that the public, Joe Public, wants to ride on these things and is willing to pay. And it's going to have a big social impact. And by the way, this 1830 inaugural run that I'll show you a picture of, there were, I'll show it to you. But the 1840s is our railway age. Highlight that. Hopefully, in 1839, you weren't dumb enough to buy canal stock because it became worthless almost overnight once the canals were seen as
so many industrial changes, the origins of railways go back to the coal industry. For several hundred years, coal had been carried by sea from the coalfields of northeastern England to London. But the problem the coal owners faced was how to get their coal from the pit heads to the ports. The answer was the railway, in which wagons could be pushed by men or pulled by horses along specially made tracks made first of wood, but later of iron. But it was not until a new source of power was found that the railway came into its own. That power came from the steam locomotive.
The advantage of the railway was that it could haul large quantities of goods much more efficiently. In 1813, when this locomotive, Puffing Billy, was built by William Hedley for use in the Durham coalfield, it could haul more than 20 wagons of coal at 5 miles an hour.
5 miles an hour.
And each wagon held more
That's really
than
pushing
a
it
single
now.
horse-drawn cart. The first workable steam locomotive was developed by the Cornishman Richard Trevithick, and it was tried out successfully on the Penydarren line in South Wales in 1804. It was the subject of a bet between two ironmasters from Merthyr Tydfil, Humphrey and Crawshay. They were very different in character. Humphrey was a progressive, but Crawshay was more interested in profit than in change. The bet was to see if the locomotive could travel from Merthyr to Abercynon and back in a day. This was a long journey for an engine more accustomed to working in the confines of a colliery. Dr. Stuart Owen Jones, curator of the Cardiff Industrial and Maritime Museum, has written a book in which he tells us about that bet.
I think our story starts a little bit before this great epic journey. Trevithick had already built 2 road locomotives driven by steam, one in Cornwall and one in London. And when he was persuaded to go to the Penydarren Ironworks by the owner, a man named Humphrey, this man was already aware of these 2 road locomotives. Now, one of the other ironworks was the Cyfarthfa Works, owned by a man called Crawshay, and he was not very progressive. As long as he made his profit tomorrow, he was happy. So can you imagine this one-man Crawshay talking to Humphrey, very interested in progress, new developments, new technologies. And the conversation might well have been Humphrey saying, I'm certain he could build a locomotive to run on rails. Crawshay saying, nonsense, old boy, quite ridiculous, never take place. So Trevithick is a bet. Trevithick is challenged to build his locomotive to run on rails, and this he duly did. The precise nature of the bet was that he could haul 10 tons of iron on the wagons from Merthyr down to Abercynon and haul the empty wagons back in one day. And on the appointed day that took place, 1 or 2 little hiccups on the route, chopping trees down on the way down, water leaking out of the boiler on the way back, but they finally returned to Merthyr by nightfall and the wager was settled, and the history of movement on rails took a different path from that day forth.
But the key person in the widespread development and application of the steam railway was George Stephenson. On the Stockton and Darlington Railway, which opened in 1825, Stephenson used steam locomotives, stationary engines, and even horses. He found that the steam locomotive, propelling itself on its own wheels, could pull coal 30% more cheaply than other methods. The first big commercial success for a railway was the Liverpool to Manchester line, which opened 5 years later in 1830. Unlike the Stockton and Darlington, which at first only carried goods, the Liverpool and Manchester was designed to carry people too. To the surprise of the railway's owners, passenger traffic was enormous. The age of the railway had arrived.
Like the stagecoaches before them, the first railways offered different standards of comfort. On the old road coaches, you paid more if you sat inside, less if you sat on the roof. And it was the same with the early railways. The first railway carriages even looked a bit like stagecoaches. And if you were a first-class passenger, then you sat on cushions, you had upholstery, and somewhere to put your top hat. But if you travelled second class, then you had to make do with a wooden bench. But at least you had a roof over your head.
Third-class passengers had to travel in open carriages with wooden seats and brave the elements and the smoke, although soon even these carriages were fitted with primitive roofs. By 1847, £252 million had been invested in railways, nearly 7% of Britain's national income, in order to build some 9,500 miles of railway. By the early 1850s, virtually all the major routes in Britain had been built, most of them centred on London. London was linked by rail to Bristol, Birmingham, Newcastle, and before long Wales and Scotland too were embraced by the new network of railways. The period of the 1840s was called the Railway Mania. Such was the enthusiasm for investors to make money out of it. At its peak in the 1920s, there were 23,000 miles of railway in Britain. More than 250,000 men were engaged on building the railway. They were called navvies. The name comes from the navigators who half a century earlier had built Britain's canals. They worked with picks and shovels, and they were paid by how much muck they shifted. The usual amount was 14 wagons of earth for a pair of navvies per day. No wonder they gained the reputation of being big eaters, drinkers, and fighters. They travelled from one job to the next, often sleeping rough. Working conditions were atrocious, and there were many accidents. But, like building construction workers before and since, it was the high wages that attracted them.
Although the original idea of the railway was to carry coal, it had its greatest social impact as a carrier of people. From the time of the Romans, the pace at which a man could travel was governed by the speed of the horse. But with the coming of the steam railway, passengers could travel at 30 miles an hour. An astonishing, exhilarating, but often frightening experience. By the end of the century, this locomotive, City of Truro, was the first to travel at 100 miles an hour.
Okay, so just a few other images here. This is the Great Western in New York Harbor. It was launched in 1837. You'll notice that what kind of a ship is it? Where is the mechanism for moving it. Yeah, and that we'll find these paddle wheelers don't do well in open ocean. That's why they ultimately end up in the United States up the rivers, like the Mississippi River, where you have the paddle wheelers. You still have the rigging on here. That's because, again, the steam engine was known to break down, and if you're in the middle of the ocean, you might want to. That'll stay around for a while. We'll see the rigging stay on. This is Trevithick's road locomotive. I know. And actually, in 1803, there was an accident that killed 4. It's not that unusual. The guy in the back is standing right next to it, I guess, loading it up with fire there. Trevithick also had what was referred to as his steam circus. So he had his locomotive, the famous locomotive of "Catch Me Who Can," and you would. Why is the fence around it so tall? So again, you want to pay to get in. All right, you're going to pay to get in. So admission was 1 shilling.
They're cheap bastards.
Okay. Jonathan, you're leaving campus. By the way, this image here of Trevithick, of the rocket, Stephenson's rocket, that's a contemporary drawing of it. Here is the rocket in 1829, and it began officially in 1830. See, the problem was that it created a new problem, and that the first locomotives didn't have brakes. You got a problem then. So they would throw like a log on the tracks to stop it, and then they work on that. But this one competed against 2 other steam locomotives covering a 1.5 miles course at an average speed of 14 miles per hour. What they found is people just came out and they wanted to ride, and people fainted because going 16 miles an hour was like launching to the moon. This thing, you take Stevenson, take him out to Magic Mountain and put him on one of the, he'll just die of a heart attack right away. Or take him out in the freeway. They'll probably hold on for dear life. Oh my God, I'm dying. And then of course you can go to the famous Rocket Museum in Britain to see the rocket. And by the way, this cylindrical locomotive style was really determined by both Trevithick and Stephenson as the most efficient. But with a problem on this Liverpool to Manchester inaugural run here, what's missing on the train? Yeah, they didn't have a new roof because that was a problem had to be solved when it started to rain. So the cheap seats were on the open air carts. I know, and it's not going very fast, 16 miles an hour to start with, okay? But people are really thinking they're living the big life. Living the speed.
Living the fast life.
In the fast lane.
All right.
Need for speed.
The significance of the railway will be that we will have standardized products. Standardized products because they can now move goods along the rail lines. They're all going to look the same, be packaged the same, and people would recognize them. It's like you go to New York City, you go to a grocery store, everything in the store looks like what we have here. Because there's standardized packaging, standardized products, standardized quality. You also then can have fresh milk delivered to the city. You don't have to have cows kept in the city, which add to the water pollution. You can milk the cows at 3 in the morning in the countryside, load that on 4 o'clock in the morning, and an hour later it's in London, picked up there and delivered to your front step by the milkman. Time has to be standardized because you can't operate railroads when you have all different times. You've got to have departure and arrival times that are synced throughout the country. And then, lo and behold, tourism begins to take off. And that's something that the middle class will ultimately be able to take advantage of. And then what we're going to see is the famous Crystal Exhibition of 1851. will see 6 million visitors, most of whom arrived by train. 6 million visitors. This will be the first World's Fair. It's 1851, and it's the first World's Fair that promoted British industrial. Okay, so we just have a little bit more, one more video clip that we didn't get to. I'll be going over some more of the essays. It's a short day, so I want to finish this essay, and I'm going to send you the next PowerPoint, which is a short one on the economic isms.